I'm Fraser Douglas, the avid tent camper. In this video, I want to discuss a problem related to tent camping that I believe we need to directly address. That problem is confusing the meanings of the word cabin tent and umbrella tent by referring to modern umbrella tents as cabin tents. Just a few years ago, tent campers knew what an umbrella tent was and would have been proud to own one. But today, most tent campers don't know what an umbrella tent is because umbrella tents have been confused with cabin tents. This is one of many examples of sloppy language in our culture. Another example is confusing margarine with butter. Although butter comes from cow's milk, while margarine comes from soybeans or corn or other vegetable fats, and although each product has its own unique set of health benefits and risks, and although butter tastes much, much better than margarine, many children are being served margarine today and being told that it is butter. As a result, we're going to have a generation of children who do not know the difference between margarine and real butter. Similarly, we're going to have a generation of campers that do not know the difference between a cabin tent and an umbrella tent, unless we make those distinctions clear today. So let's begin with a little history. Both cabin tents and umbrella tents emerged in the early 1900s and became extremely popular for family camping during the late 1940s and 1950s. Cabin tents evolved from wedge tents and wall tents. Wedge tents were typically used by poor people and by lower-level enlisted men in the Army, and they came in a variety of sizes. Some were tall enough to stand up in the middle, while others were much shorter. The old Army dog tent or pup tent is an example of a small wedge tent. Wall tents were a little bit nicer because the elevated sidewall gave more interior space that allowed the user to move around a little bit more inside the tent. Regardless of their specific size and wall design, these wedge tents and wall tents had one distinctive feature. Their primary structural support was a rigid center ridgepole that was held upright by two vertical support poles, typically one at the front door and one at the back door. This was my first store-bought tent, bought back in 1968. It is an old Army surplus wall tent that has the rigid center ridgepole that's held in place by two vertical upright poles, one in the middle of the front door and one at the back of the tent. Cabin and cottage tents began to appear around 1915-1920. They were large and tall wall tents with a sewn-in floor and sewn-in windows, but they still retain that rigid center ridgepole with the two vertical upright poles, one at the front door and one at the back door. This was my old cabin tent that was purchased used in 1975. After their initial introduction in the early 1900s, tent makers began to make a wide variety of cabin tents. Some were very large, some were just moderately large, but all of them had windows and sewn-in floors and the rigid center ridgepole. Although many tent users like the cabin tent, They specifically did not like that vertical pole in the middle of the front door. And so several manufacturers tried to design other ways to hold that center ridge pole upright without having the vertical support pole in the front door. Here are some examples of other cabin tents that have been produced over the last 50 years. Notice that they all have that rigid center ridge pole. For most cabin tents, that ridge pole is straight, but the Coleman Weathermaster cabin tent, that center ridge pole is curved. Recently, Kodiak Canvas has developed this flex bow tent, which is very unusual, but it still does have the center ridge pole, and thus could be called a cabin tent. And now let's talk a little bit about umbrella tents. Umbrella tents evolved from Native American teepees, Old English bell tents, and Civil War Sibley tents. Smaller versions of these tents were called range tents, miners' tents, and pyramid tents. The primary structural feature of all of these tents is that the poles converge at the top of the tent to make a peak from which the roof and the sides fall away equally in all directions. At first, these umbrella tents were supported by a single center pole that went from the ground up to the peak, with ribs that opened up like an umbrella to support the roof and the vertical sidewalls. A little while later, corner side poles were placed inside the tent, but these inside poles were soon replaced by outside poles that bent over across the roof and converged at the peak. Here are some examples of umbrella tents that were produced during the 1950s and 1960s. While the structural differences between cabin tents and umbrella tents seem very clear, tent makers and outdoor equipment salespeople began to confuse the meanings of these two terms in the early 2000s. Tent makers continued to make modern versions of the old umbrella tents, but started calling them cabin tents. Just because they were tall enough to stand in, they had sewed-in windows and sewed-in floors. I bought this old Eureka headquarters tent in about 2003, and to the best of my knowledge, it is the last umbrella tent that was actually called an umbrella tent. Today, this Eureka Copper Canyon tent is a very nice tent for family camping, but it's called a cabin tent when it clearly has structural features of an umbrella tent. I think Coleman started this trend by calling their instant tent a cabin or instant cabin tent. This Ozark Trail Walmart umbrella tent is also called a cabin tent. Similarly, this Pahake Green Mountain tent was called a cabin tent when it clearly has the structural features of an umbrella tent. And finally, this Cabela's Getaway Cabin 6, which is a very nice tent for camping, actually shares structural features with the old umbrella tents, not the cabin tents. So, what can we do about this problem? Well, I believe that in order to fully enjoy tent camping as much as possible, tent campers need to learn as much as they can about the history and the language of tent camping. so that they can appreciate subtle strengths and differences of different pieces of equipment. For more information about past and current tents, please visit my website, www.basictentcamping.com, and visit my Facebook page, Modern Tent Camping. Also watch my early YouTube videos on tents and tent history. Remember, take more trips, travel further, visit more attractions, and save money. Go tent camping.